Jenny Iacovisi. I'm going to be in conversation today with Elliot Ackerman. A few words about me. I'm an author. I write historical fiction. I am here with Washington Independent Review of Books, which is an online review site. We publish new reviews and content every day. If you're interested, right by the City Hall, we have our booth there, and you can sign up to receive our newsletter about our reviews. I was privileged enough to get to review Elliot's book, Dark at the Crossing, which is how I was introduced to Elliot's work. We're looking forward to a great conversation today. If you're not familiar with Elliot, he's the author of both Green on Blue, which I have here, National Book Award finalist Dark at the Crossing, and the upcoming Waiting for Eden, which he's brought an arc of today. He is based in New York and Washington, D.C. He has covered the Syrian civil war since 2013, often from Istanbul. His writings have appeared in, among other publications, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and The New York Times Magazine, and his stories have been included in the Best American Short Stories. He's both a former White House Fellow and a Marine, and has served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. So today we are talking with Elliot Ackerman. So here we are.
Great, thank you.
So one of the first things that I thought when I first discovered your work is that I sensed that with Green on Blue, which was your debut, the fact that you used a first-person Afghani narrator, Aziz, was sort of a revelation to people. That was the thing that people seem to remark on all the time. And to me, the level of empathy that you show in your story is stunning. And then in Dark at the Crossing, Harris is a native Iraqi naturalized American. So again, in both stories, you're using non-American narrators, which seemed like it was a revelation to American audiences. And so what's your sense of why that seems so surprising to people?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. It's good to be at this festival. It's the second time I've done it now. But to your question, Jenny, I think I, in fact, was sort of surprised that it seemed like a revelation to people. I think, the job of a novelist is to sort of imagine worlds that are not our own. But furthermore, these are characters that I didn't actually feel like I had that much difference with. I actually felt I had a lot in common with these characters. So, my first novel, Green on Blue, the protagonist is a young Afghan soldier named Aziz, and the novel is basically the story of an Afghan who kills an American, but it's all told in the first person from the Afghan's perspective. And the second novel, Dark at the Crossing, is about a man named Harris Abadi. It's mainly told from his perspective, and he is an Iraqi American who is attempting to cross from southern Turkey into Syria. And particularly with Harris, one of the things that always interested me was, he is a naturalized American citizen. So people often say, you're not writing about an American. I kind of like to, smile and point out, like, actually, I am. He is American, depending on your definition of an American. But ultimately, I think that the job not only of a novelist, but I think anyone who is working in the arts is, in many ways, empathy. It's trying to understand the emotions of others, and and how do we do that in our work? Well, all I can say is that I don't know about all of you, but if I go out and watch a movie, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a movie theater and I'll admit, and we get to the end of the film, I start choking up, I'm crying, Frozen comes to mind, but I could go down the list. Yeah, she's waving her hand in the back. Maybe not about that. But, or you go to a museum and you see a piece of art and you feel completely overwhelmed by it. So I can tell you, when I'm sitting there and I'm writing, and if it's going well, and I'm working on a book or a story, I will feel something as I am writing. And if that can be found by the publishers, go half a world away, somebody can read that story. And if they even feel a fraction of what I felt as I was writing it, you know, in many respects, my emotion has been then transferred to them, and something I could only call emotional transference. And I think that's actually what all art does. It's actually sort of the purpose of art. The purpose of art is empathy. The purpose of art is for all of us to transfer, is to try at least to transfer what we're feeling to other people through stories, through painting, through pick your medium. And if you think about that, you know, that idea that some person can understand how I feel and I can give them that feeling, like it is like an inherently optimistic act that we can be connected through our emotions. And, you know, for someone who has participated in and covered wars, and, you know, these books deal with those subjects, you know, that optimism, you know, kind of comes out of a desire to, you know, having seen a lot of destruction, want to then go create something.
Did you find that, I mean, part of it to me was, I think, surprise from your being a veteran of both of those theaters of war. I think maybe that was where people were coming from, that I'm not even sure why that does seem surprising, but I do wonder whether what your brothers in arms from the American side thought about your stories. Did they have a different take on it than other people?
You know, I would say, you know, I've come up against sort of this, you know, line of reasoning before, which is that, well, you know, Elliot, we all, you know, my experience in Afghanistan, you know, we fought against Afghans, and now you're writing from their perspective, and one might presume that that would be seen as sort of disloyal. But right, but you would actually be surprised. I think the people who have that experience know intuitively that they have a great deal in common with the people they fought against. And what I mean by that is, you know, the experience of going to war in the last decade in particular, you know, became, I think for most people of my generation who went to war, it's sort of the defining experience of your life. And you get to the other side of that experience and you start to process it. And suddenly, you know, you very quickly realize that there is sort of this, you know, this group of people you are engaged in this shadow dance with. And they are the people that you fought against. And you also realize that they were similarly defined as you were. And there's a curiosity that exists there. You know, who were these people that were on the opposite side of this experience? You know, and that's something I've addressed a lot in my journalism, is going back to the battlefields and sort of interacting with people that who I fought against.
Right. And one of the things that you had said about Green on Blue was that you wrote it initially as a tribute to 2 Afghan soldiers. And I was wondering, because I read your article in Vogue in 2015, where you wrote about Murtaza and Sabir. Were those the 2 people?
No, actually, the 2, it's actually the 2 to whom the book are dedicated to Ali and Big Cheese, who was a guy named Aziz. His nickname was Big Cheese. Okay. But it was to them specifically, and they were 2 that I was also close with. But, you know, one of the, you know, I mean, when you set out to write a book, you know, obviously it's a very long journey, and it can kind of, you know, bend and take different shapes. It's sort of the ambition of Green on Blue in many respects was to try to tell the story of the Afghan war, which is an exceedingly complex conflict. It varies everywhere you go, but to try to tell a story that was the war in a microcosm. So if you read the book, you'll see, you know, there is one militia in the book. There's one village in which they're fighting. There's, you know, one group of Taliban they're fighting against. And so what I was trying to do was tease out, because I served all over Afghanistan, the reoccurring themes that I would see, whether I was spending time in the Northeast or the Southeast or, you know, in the West, and try to put that into a story that frankly kind of felt a little bit like a parable almost. Right. But it's not, you know, so in that way too, the tribute to Ali and Aziz, yes, it's a tribute to them, but frankly, you know, the goal of the book as a whole was sort of a larger tribute, and not specific to just the 2 of them.
Interesting. One thing that I pulled out was that in that article you used the simile "faced like an anvil," and I noticed that showed up at least twice in one or the other of the books, and I thought it was such a great image of kind of ready for anything, or it's been through everything. And so that is a very striking image to me. I think the one thing that sort of, I don't know, was painful to me was in Green on Blue, the discussion of how the war was basically being propagated as an end in itself. right? That it was being, and basically that the one leader, the one insurgent leader, was financing the people who were fighting against them. And that then, at some point, the Americans were complicit in that.
Right.
And so rather than anybody working for peace, they were working to continue to propagate the war because everybody was profiting from it. And that, the question, I think, for me is, so was that your view on it while you were in the middle of it?
Sure. Yes, in
Wow.
short.
I mean, that's just ripping, right?
Right. I mean, on many levels. I think,
Right.
people behave according to the incentive structures within their life.
Right.
And there can be many incentives in war, whether if you're in the U.S. military, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but the incentive could be, I need to go successfully deploy to a combat zone as a commander of a battalion to get promoted to become a brigade commander 5 years later. So people cycle in and out of the wars, and they might not be there with a specific aim of ending it. Or, in the book you see that, many of the Afghans who are working with the coalition forces, it becomes a type of a living for them. So, we in our domestic lives will talk about, cycles of violence, how violence can cause a chain reaction that manifests in more violence through generations of a family, for instance.
Right.
But it's odd that we don't sort of talk about it in the same way societally. One of the things that always struck me, having served in Iraq and in Afghanistan, there was a real difference between the two. My first time in Iraq was in 2004, so relatively recently after our invasion. And you would sit down, you go on patrol, and you would sit down with local leaders, and you would have these conversations about, peace. Like, well, we have to do this, we have to try to tamp down the insurgency so we can kind of get things peaceful in this neighborhood. And, and when you're talking, they understood what peace was, like all of us do. And it was this, we need to go back to how things were, frankly, before you all invaded, and they had an idea from under Saddam. Well, what was very different is you go to Afghanistan, and at that point I've been, and when you're talking to the similarly placed power brokers, and you talk to them, because we have to tamp things down in this valley to get it so there's peace. Well, the average life expectancy for a male living out in the provinces in Afghanistan is 63 years old. So the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979.
Right.
So, sort of as we're getting right now, the generation of people who were, in their late teens and early 20s when the Soviets invaded, who have adult memories of peace, they're actually dying off. And so most of the people you would sit down with and you say to them, like, so we can bring peace to your valley, they would shake their heads. But there was a very clear, you realized that for them, this wasn't a process of returning life to a condition that it was before. It was a process of, frankly, of sheer imagination. They had to imagine what peace would look like out of whole cloth. And that's a very, very different type of conversation. And I think it shows how a whole society can shift into these cycles of violence where war just becomes so deeply embedded you can't escape it. It's part of the economy.
Right. And yet we are allowed to walk away at some point, right? So we've helped to usher something in, and then we get to leave when we decide it's too expensive or we don't want to be there anymore, and we've engendered an entire set of generations of people who've never known anything but that.
Well, sure.
Right.
And I think, when we look at whether it's our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or even our involvement in places that aren't Iraq and Afghanistan, like in the Syrian civil war, for instance, or things we're doing in the Horn of Africa or in Yemen, what's happened societally in the U.S. Every time we've gone to war with a certain paradigm. Whether it was the national mobilization of the Second World War or the draft during Vietnam. And usually in the past, those paradigms have actually made it very visceral for us to be at war. Societally, it's incredibly disruptive. I mean, if you read about the Civil War, Lincoln was like barely able to keep the army in the field because everybody, frankly, wanted to go home.
Right.
Like, this was upending everyone's lives. Well, after September 11th, when we went into these wars, and I understand the decision-making behind it, but there were very intentional structural mechanisms that were put in place so that our leaders wouldn't face that. And what I mean specifically is we went to war with an all-volunteer army, and I frankly believe there's always going to be enough 19-year-olds in this country who want to go sort of prove something to themselves and will enlist to go overseas and fight. And we funded the war through deficit spending, so no one's getting taxed. So to go back to that idea of people behave according to their incentive structures, you know, whole vast swaths of this country, you know, they're not incented to pay attention. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean they're morally corrupt. It just means, you know, the war's not something that I'm interested in. No one's telling me that I have to pay taxes for it. No one's telling me that my son or daughter has to go fight in it. I'm disengaged.
Right.
So that allows us, you know, we talk about how people here can just come home and disengage from it. You know, we are sort of the perfect society to engage in this perpetual war in Afghanistan because we are perfectly set up to send our armies overseas to engage in perpetual war. So the question becomes, you know, at what point do we societally start running a significant moral hazard? You know, where things are being done in our name that because we are living our lives here, we kind of aren't in touch with. You know, I mean, you know, we're fighting a proxy war in Yemen right now. Most people, I think, aren't paying close attention to that. And it's not because they're bad people. It's because we have engineered our wars socially, you know, in that way. And if that's something that we want to continue to do, I mean, we'll continue to do, and we'll elect leaders who have that policy, but it comes at a price.
Right, exactly. And again, every so often they come out with the list of, do you know how many countries the U.S. is bombing right now? And again, coming up with that total is a
well, and I think it goes hand in hand, too, when, you know, often as Americans, when we travel overseas, you know, it can be puzzling. We're like, why are we experiencing this, why is there this animus towards the United States overseas? And it's because, you know, the stories we tell ourselves at home, you know, my experience has been, are very, very different than the way people experience us abroad. And that disconnect, you know, I think it's very dangerous.
Right. So I guess one of the things that I noticed in both of these books is the concept of there basically not being a choice about things. So very much like this, that we have choices because we are going out to somebody else's country. The people who are in that country don't necessarily have a lot of choices. And so the one thing that I noticed between these two books is the concept of one alternative. When you have one alternative, that means you don't have a choice. So in Green on Blue, Aziz says, I had no one but Ali. To care for him was my single alternative. And single alternatives have a logic all their own. And then in Dark at the Crossing, Harris is observing Daphne and says, possessing one option unburdened her of choice. Harris recognized the freedom she found in this. He thought of the sleeping bundles around the elms, the people who were sleeping in the park. With such little control over their circumstances, their lives also contained but one option. They couldn't simplify themselves further. Harris wondered if he had reached that point of reduction. And so that concept of truly, these are the circumstances that people have been handed, and there's only so much they can do with them. But having that one option, which from our perspective, one option means you don't get a choice, right?
Right.
And
yeah, and I think thematically, choice is something I deal with in these books. You know, specifically in Dark at the Crossing. I mean, the story of Dark at the Crossing is Harris Abadi is this Iraqi American, and you learn his backstory very quickly. Was he fought for the Americans in Iraq, but he feels morally conflicted about that, and so he is able to get U.S. citizenship, comes back, and then feeling somewhat rootless in the U.S., he decides that when the Arab Spring happens, this seems to be a cause that's really worth fighting for. And so he flies into Turkey and tries to cross the border. He doesn't make it very far. He basically gets robbed at the border, and he's taken in by Amir and Daphne, who are a Syrian couple that were very active in the revolution, and they had a daughter. But one day, Amir was out of their apartment building running an errand, and there was an explosion in the apartment building. They lived in Aleppo at the time. The building collapsed. Sort of miraculously, with the daughter and the wife in it, they were able to pull the wife out of the wreckage. Unconscious, he was presented with a choice, which was whether to keep looking for his daughter or to take the wife across the border. He takes his wife across the border, and when she wakes up, she wants to know what's happened to the daughter. And Amir, the husband, having seen what he saw in this building, says, you know, there's no way she's alive, and we're here in southern Turkey now. Well, the wife can't accept that loss that she hasn't seen. The husband won't go back. And entering into their marriage is this guy, Harris Abadi, the Iraqi American who wants to cross the border and fight. So ultimately, this book, Dark at the Crossing, is a novel about choices. It's about who crosses, who stays, and why. But, I also do a lot of work as a journalist, and what I'm often trying to do in my fiction is trying to take what are very complicated international events, like the Syrian civil war, for instance, and think about what is their emotional equivalency? What does it feel like to go through the experience of standing out in the street under the Assad regime and demanding your rights in a sort of irrefutable cause, right? We want democratic reforms, and because we've been living in an authoritarian society for the last 40 years. It's tough to argue with that. And then seeing that revolution completely destroy your home. What is that experience like? And many of the Syrians I talked to, they said, the closest thing they said it felt like was there was a real serious sense of heartbreak, in that they had fallen in love with the idea of what the revolution could be. And so, my novels, I'm trying to take a reader on a journey that's a little bit more intimate than, talking about, various sub-tribes and tribes in Afghan valleys or all the intricacies of who's against whom in the Syrian civil war. So Dark at the Crossing, fundamentally, is the story of a failed revolution, but it's told through this very intimate story of a failed marriage, which is the marriage between Amir and Daphne. And if you think about that, a marriage is sort of a revolution of sorts. Two people living separate lives meet one another. They kind of have a vision of what their life could live like together, both agreeing to that vision. Oh, you're nodding. We can get to that in the questions. But both agreeing to that vision, they try to create a new world. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, there's a lot of broken glass and heartbreak. So, that's often what I'm trying to do in my fiction, is to try to take a reader on a journey that's accessible to them. So at the end of it, they might not necessarily know more factually about, all of the detailed personalities in Syria or the sub-tribes in Afghanistan. They might have gone on an emotional journey that is somewhat equivalent to what it's like to participate in these global events.
Right. And what was interesting to me is that, again, going back to that having a choice or not, to me it felt as though Daphne and Harris were so single-minded that it was almost as though they themselves had no free will. They had no choice in this matter. They were pushed. Amir doesn't feel that way. He's hanging back, and to me, normally that would make him the sane one, right? This is there's no way to see how this is going to end well. And so Amir's unwillingness to do it seems to make him kind of the sane one. But in these circumstances, it makes him feel cowardly. And to a great degree, he cedes his spot to Harris. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering how you see Amir in terms of is he the pragmatic one? Is he doesn't have it in himself anymore? He was heartbroken by the revolution, and in fact he feels guilt about his role in how the building came down, right? So I'm just wondering how you see Amir in that situation.
Well, I think specifically to his character, whether I think he's good or bad is sort of beside the point. And there are a lot of characters in all these books who are not necessarily, who you would think are sympathetic characters. I mean, Green on Blue is about an Afghan who, murders an American, and there's plenty about that specific Afghan. But I think, when you're writing, if you want to write, whole round characters, you want to allow every character to really make their case as though they're making their case, before God is the way that's been put. So you have to try to completely inhabit them. So I'm frankly saying, as a writer, I'm really trying to understand Amir, and I think there's a lot to admire in him, even though this is a guy who says, I can't go back to my home, I'm not looking for my daughter, I am done. He at least is someone who has enough integrity to acknowledge his limitations.
Right, and he again supports Daphne to the degree that he can in her choice. The fact that she can't go on unless she goes back across the border.
Yeah.
So again, he does the best job that he can, which is, I think, basically what almost all your characters do, is the best that they can.
And what all of us are trying to do.
Exactly, exactly. So your next book, Waiting for Eden, is coming out in September, and I was mentioning to Elliot that his book is up for us to review at Washington Independent, and I had to give up the opportunity to review it in order to be allowed to talk to him today, because once I know the author, I'm not allowed to review his book. So.
Isn't there a caveat? If I'm like a really huge jerk, you can give me a bad review?
It was a hard choice to make, but it's great to be here. But it's funny because I started to read about Waiting for Eden, and what I was thinking was, Green on Blue to me felt very intimate. It's told very intimately. Very few characters, and it's a tight story. Dark at the Crossing almost felt claustrophobic because of the way that there's almost no air in the room. At some point, Harris is crawling through a drainage tunnel, and that's, to me, kind of how the book felt. It's very, very almost claustrophobic.
We should get that blurb for the paperback. As good as a drainage tunnel.
There you go. The feeling of a drainage tunnel. But then, as I'm reading the synopsis of Waiting for Eden, I'm not even sure what word I would use.
How about belly button?
Because it's actually apparently told from, it's about a comatose soldier, right? And it's narrated by his dead buddy, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit about Waiting for Eden?
Can I read?
Yes, and we're gonna have.
Okay, I like your intro because it's like they each get progressively
smaller. Exactly. There you go.
Yeah. So this is just the opening of the book. I promise it's brief. I don't like it when people read for too long. So I want you to understand Mary and what she did, but I don't know if you will. You've got to wonder if in the end you'd make the same choice, circumstances being similar or even the same, God help you. But when I first met her in Eden, times were better. They were trying to start a family then. And months later, on that night in the Hammerin Valley, I was sitting next to Eden and luckier than him when our Humvee hit a pressure plate, killing me and everybody else, him barely surviving. Ever since then, I've been around too, just on that other side, seeing all there is and waiting. 3 years have gone by, and my friends spent every day of it laid out in that burn center in San Antonio. I could give you the catalog of his injuries, but I won't. Not because I don't think you could stomach it, but because I don't think it'd really tell you much about what type of a way he's in. So I'll tell you this. He used to weigh 220 pounds, and some mornings, when we work out together, he'd press well over 150 above his head, sweat pouring from beneath his black hair. Before we deployed, he and I both went to SEER school. That's the one up in Maine where they teach you what to do in case you become a prisoner. For a couple of weeks, the instructors starved us and roughed us up pretty bad. Then the course ended, and those same instructors had a graduation party with us. That night at the party, I watched him pound 5 pints of Guinness in almost as many minutes. He held it all down, too. But I'll also tell you that if you ever went to his house for dinner, he wouldn't serve Guinness. He'd likely do all the cooking and serve you a bottle of wine he'd chosen specially for your visit. He could tell you all about the wine, the viticulture considerations in the soil of the vineyard, the seasonal high and low temperatures of the year it was bottled. And when you were done with that in the main course, he'd serve chocolate with hot pepper or sea salt or some other fancy thing mixed in. He said that stuff brought out the flavor. I still don't know if that's true, but I like that he said it. I'll tell you that every guy in the platoon had a nickname. One pervy guy was called Handjob because he had all sorts of weird porn on his computer. And another guy, a kind of dumb guy, was called Wedge because a wedge is the world's simplest tool. But Eden's nickname was Base Jump. One time during a hurricane party at the barracks, he got in drunk, and with a poncho spread over his head, he leapt from the 3rd deck. When the wind carried him a bit and he landed on both feet, the name was his. That's how he treated the whole world, too. Like it was a series of cliffs that existed for no other reason than for him to jump off. At least before the pressure plate. But now I don't know what to call him. The 70 pounds that's left of him in the bed, he's had a lot of infections and they've cut all of him up to the torso, isn't base jump. And it isn't the name he was born with. I don't think anyone really knows what to call him. Except for Mary. She calls him her husband.
Yikes. And so what is the genesis of this story?
You know, I mean, this story is fundamentally, it's about their marriage, and you know, it's about the narrator, you know, who's unnamed, who's the best friend, who died in this accident, and Eden, and the wife, and I think it's sort of, you know, it's not really a war. I don't think of it at all as a war book, although, you know, the thing that puts him in the bed is the war. Frankly, writing it could have been anything, but you know, it's about what it means to be faithful to someone. And how, you know, faithfulness or unfaithfulness can ricochet out and take all sorts of strange forms. You know, so ultimately the book is, at its core, the story, you know, is Mary's choice of what to do with Eden. And, you know, right after this passage, she, for the first time in 3 years, goes home for a few days over Christmas, and Eden suffers a stroke. And when he suffers that stroke, sort of his mind gets reordered, and certain things come back, even as certain parts of him failed. And so it's almost like he has this brief moment of consciousness where all of the past comes rushing back, and he is able to sort of reclaim a little bit of agency that he hadn't had before in his life. And so the story is about those few days.
Oh, my goodness. Well, and now I'll just have to read it and not review it, but I'm looking forward to reading it. So honestly, when I talk about this, and we've gone through a little bit of this already, is that my impulse is to engage with these books from a political angle. I have trouble reading them and not thinking in terms of politically what that larger picture looks like. And honestly, I know one of the things, thank you, one of the things that for Americans, I think, particularly in Syria, we have trouble kind of understanding what's going on because it's, well, none of these wars are traditional wars anymore, right? And it's hard because Americans, just as you described, tend to be, it's some noise in the background, right? And sometimes we try to spend some time thinking about it and putting it into perspective. But honestly, it's also hard to understand how to engage. One of the things that I came away with from Dark at the Crossing is, what would success look like? I mean, what does success in these conflicts look like? But success for whom, right? Because Americans have American interests in a foreign location, but people live there and they have interests in that location there. And so when we say, well, you know, how does anybody get out? How do you do it gracefully? How do you do it without making more of a mess, right, than you started out with? And how do you actually return people to now, to your point, don't even remember what peace looks like? So it's hard for somebody who honestly is trying to figure out, how do you engage in some effective way in making change? And I try to know and understand and care, and yet what agency do I have in I wouldn't even know who to elect out or in to because I don't know what good looks like, right?
Sure.
In these conflicts.
Well, I mean, I don't want to be prescriptive, because I would think it's boring when people get up and are prescriptive necessarily. So maybe I'll say some broad things, and then often one comment that is prescriptive. But you know, I think ultimately it's the idea of, you know, why do wars keep going on, and why do they keep perpetuating themselves? And this idea, which I think is it was very foreign to me for a while until I experienced it, which is that, you know, you can fight a war for many, many reasons. I mean, you can fight a war for every single reason you could possibly imagine, except for the ending of a war. And the idea that, in fact, ending the war can be much, much more difficult than continuing the war.
Right.
I mean, and that's, I would commend to anyone the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary that came out this year. Because one of the things it really hits on is you see, even as we were going into Vietnam, all the key policymakers knew, I mean, from Kennedy back, that this wasn't going to end well. But politically, they weren't in a position, and I mean domestically, to pull us out. So we're going to keep going because Kennedy at the time knew he was very vulnerable to being seen as soft on communism, so he kept us in Vietnam. Then things escalated. It's just people couldn't politically get out of the war. I mean, it's one of the reasons Johnson didn't run for re-election. He said, I'm not going to run for re-election. I'm going to do what I can to try to navigate us out of this. And I think you see the same thing today politically, particularly in a place like Afghanistan, where in some respects it's easier to keep the war going on because the political cost of pulling everyone out or of acknowledging the fact that we're going to stay there perpetually is greater than anybody wants.
Right.
But I think the biggest force keeping us in this war is what I alluded to before, is that nothing is asked of us. I mean, if we want to talk about ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this is where I'll be prescriptive, I think if there was a draft in this country, these wars would be over inside of 2 years.
Right. Right. Or in fact, if we were not doing deficit spending,
right,
to
and
pay
everyone
for
was,
them, right?
or even better, both.
Right. Exactly. So.
And that gets to agency. Our
right.
agency as citizens. I think if your agency is a responsibility. If you want to see your country doing these things, sometimes. It's the ask not what you can do for your, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But sometimes, actually, you need your country to ask you to do something
right.
before it can be healthy.
Right, exactly. Okay, so not sure how we're going to do that, but so we have some time for questions. If folks would like to ask Elliot anything that comes up, we don't have a microphone in the audience, so you have to use your big voice. Okay.
Somebody always has to go first.
Exactly. There you go. Leslie will.
So, in your writing, how do you approach your journalism versus your fiction?
Yeah, I actually don't see a huge difference between the two. I mean, obviously, everything in the journalism has to be factually accurate, and I can't just go around making stuff up. But I mean, process-wise, there's a lot of similarity. If I'm doing a piece of journalism, I'm experiencing something, I'm taking in my surroundings. I will often, have a sense of what the story is that can evolve. I mean, oftentimes a piece of journalism, I'll think it's something and it becomes something else. But even as I'm, experiencing those things, it's almost like I'm a film director and I'm kind of cutting scenes in my head. So I'm like, this is definitely going to be in the piece. This isn't as important. And it's very similar, in fiction. I will be imagining a scene and I'm kind of cutting that scene. What images am I going to focus on? Who's going to say what? What's the critical dialogue? Do I need to show the character walking from their car into the building? Probably not. So in that way, there is, a great deal of overlap. And I think, the type of writing, whether it's in journalism and fiction, that I aspire to do is the type that I like to read, which isn't overly prescriptive, that isn't telling people what to think, but that kind of, gives the reader the generous space to draw their own conclusions. That's the type of writing I like, and so it's what I aspire to do.
All right, if nobody else is raising their hand, then I'll ask another question. So has anybody been offended of you as an American taking the voice of a native Iraqi or an Afghan?
I think there's this sort of movement and discussion of like a cultural appropriation that exists in this country right now, which, I am on the other side of. I think it's sort of, you might as well be against culture because that's what culture is. Cultures are designed to be assimilated for people to take the best of them, to evolve, to grow. I mean, if we were to follow the direction as it's been laid out by the cultural police at this moment, you can throw the Merchant of Venice in the garbage can. Let's get rid of Othello. Kick out, Beatles, Rolling Stones, Chuck Berry too. Maybelline's a Hank Williams song. I mean, so I think it's ridiculous, and I'm frankly am extremely skeptical of anyone who wants to go around telling other people what they're supposed to write and fencing off certain topics and saying, they're only for this group and not for that group, and appointing themselves the gatekeepers. I think fundamentally it's completely anti-intellectual. So yes, there are people who espouse those views, and some of them might take issue with my work, and I welcome it.
Have you had any Afghans complain?
No, actually, and it's interesting that it's never people who are from those places. Usually, they're happy that they're happy to talk to people who are interested, in where they've come from.
Exactly.
And also too, there's the experience, like I think as an author, your very job title comes with this idea of authority. So, you better have done your homework and possess enough authority over a subject so that you can write about it credibly. What I would say I am against is someone who would someone who would approach a topic, not really understand that topic, and then try to, write a book about it. Now, I mean, fortunately, the publishing gods that be probably wouldn't let that book, if it was no good, find its way into print. But what I am against is like very poor renderings of topics that, people don't know much about.
Right.
So.
We have one.
I signed up. I did ROTC in college, and I came into the ROTC before September 11th. And at the time, I wanted a job, or whether I was coming out of school, good at my job or bad at my job, it mattered. I wanted a lot of responsibility at a young age. I'd grown up overseas, and I sort of, I think I had. It gave me a different sense of what it meant to be American. Which kind of made me actually prouder of being an American. So it really made me want to give back. And I was also sort of inherently always interested in the military. So that sort of, alchemy of characteristics led me into the military. And the Marines have the best uniform, so I went in the Marines. Yeah.
And the coolest attitude, too.
Yeah.
Right. Does anybody else have any other questions? All right, just to remind everybody that Elliot will be signing copies of his book back at the author tables down here right after this. So thank you all for stopping by, and thank you, Elliot, for being here today.
Thank you all so much.